One. We are still in Unit 10, the post-war era, and we will be covering 9.4 today, which is the Great Depression. Okay, so we're starting with the election of 1928. Coolidge decided not to run for office again, and so there was a very successful businessman, a very skilled bureaucrat and politician who won the Republican nomination, Herbert Hoover. This was our guy in World War I who made it so that we did not have to go to a rationing system with like gasless Sundays and meatless Mondays and things like that. And so he was opposed to union busting, he was opposed to trust busting, and he believed that businesses were to be trusted with business. He believed that capitalists had learned their lesson and capitalists were no longer selfish like the Carnegies and the Rockefellers. So he was open to letting business just run. His opponent was Alfred Smith, who was a New York Democrat, and he was sort of the opposite of Hoover. He was Catholic, he was against prohibition, and he really represented the urban immigrant, like machine style politics of the nation's large cities. Hoover really didn't even have very much knowledge of blacks or immigrants or even like the inner workings of city life. And so Hoover wins a decisive victory over Alfred Smith. And so even though the stock market did not crash until October of 1929, Hoover did inherit some economic problems. The 20s were generally, they're called the Roaring 20s. There was a lot of economic prosperity, but there were some underlying problems that caused the stock market crash. For one, there was uneven economic growth in the 1920s. Not all sectors of the economy shared in this prosperity. For example, coal and cotton industries lagged behind the general economy. And so this actually led to falling profits for those industries, which are major industries in the United States during the 1920s. And it also led to increasing unemployment for people who worked in those industries. Another economic problem was that the consolidation of industries continued. Remember, Hoover is pro-business, so he's not going to go on a trust-busting witch hunt or anything like that because he believes that capitalists have curbed their selfish interests. But while that is going on, many industries continue to consolidate. For instance, there were 200 corporations that controlled half of all of the country's corporate assets. In terms of cars, GM, Ford, and Chrysler made up about 90% of the nation's cars. And so this consolidation of business continued. The problem with that is that if you have a consolidation of business, if you have businesses that are coming together and forming trade associations, then they can control the industry. They can control the prices, they can control the policies, and even though at this point in U.S. history we have things like the Interstate Commerce Commission, these industries can be really powerful. And the voluntary trade associations, that is like if different businesses decide that they will voluntarily join an association. The voluntary trade associations of the 20s set their own policies. They were pretty much free to do as they wished and were self-regulating, which means that they were controlling the prices for their industry. Okay, so by far the weakest sector of the economy was agriculture. The reason why is because farming had experienced like a surge of activity during World War I because they were producing enough food for the soldiers. The problem is with all of these farms, and on top of it you have the mechanization of farming, so you have lots of machines that make farming faster. That leads to the overproduction of food. So it sounds like a good thing to have more than enough food, but the problem is if you have too much of something, then the price of that good, or the food, goes down. And so you have these farmers who have borrowed money to farm for the year, and then they have too much food, so the price goes down, and now they can't pay their loans back. And so this is a major issue leading up to and a significant cause of the Great Depression. And then another really significant cause of the Great Depression is speculation. So there were individuals and companies who invested a ton of money in speculative ventures. What this means is that they were investing in stocks or property with the hope of great gain, but also the risk of great loss. And to make it worse, some of these people were borrowing money for speculation. So they were borrowing money to invest in really risky stocks or properties. And so when those stocks and properties did not yield the gain that they thought it would, then these people lost their money. And then those who had borrowed money to pay for it couldn't pay their loans back. All right, so the stock market crash. All right, so early in 1928, the stock market raced ahead, like highest stock prices in a long time. And honestly, they continued to climb higher and higher during the first half of 1929. The market did waver a little bit in September of 1929, but it wasn't enough to cause concern. And then the stock market collapses, and this productive boom, this age of prosperity of the 1920s, comes to an end on October 29th, 1929. And so 16 million shares were sold because people just feared what was going to happen, so they rapidly sold their shares, and the prices of stocks plummeted. All right, so looking at Herbert Hoover's response to the Great Depression, I will say two things before I talk about Hoover. One, it's important to remember that the stock market collapse was not the cause of the Great Depression. There were several causes of the Great Depression. This was a really intricate, complex economic issue that did not have a single cause. The stock market collapse was more of a symptom of the economic instability of the 20s. So it's important to note that that did not cause the Great Depression. Another thing is that it's important to remember that the Great Depression did not just impact the United States. This was a worldwide phenomenon. And this was something that another cause of the Great Depression worldwide was the economic imbalances resulting from World War I. Think about Germany coming out of World War I. Their currency is worthless. There's actually a picture in our AP World History book where there's a German man he's actually taking the German mark, like their dollar, and putting it on his walls as wallpaper because it is essentially worthless. And the Germans weren't the only ones who were struggling. They were struggling a lot. But the UK and France they were also suffering. We talked about yesterday how they weren't even able to pay back their loans to the United States. So we had to come up with the Dawes Plan, loan money to Germany so that they could pay France and Great Britain, and then France and Great Britain could pay us back. So important to keep in mind that this was a worldwide issue. Hoover, his response was completely and totally inadequate to this major economic issue. He relies on volunteerism. That is like churches and organizations that would help feed the poor or provide relief or things like that. He really didn't see that it was the government's responsibility to provide that. So he relied on volunteer organizations, which quickly ran out of funds, and then mutual self-interest. And so he believed that the economy would recover as businesses and consumers, or businesses would work for the mutual benefit of their own business, but also make it so that consumers could continue to buy products, even though the prices continued to plummet. And so all of this comes from the fact that Hoover was conservative and he did not believe that the federal government had the right to spend money it didn't have, and he believed that the government did not have the right to expand to the point where they were giving people money. With that said, he actually did lend money to farmers, and he made it so that banks could offer credit more easily by getting rid of some of the regulations on offering people credit. But he really did not provide direct relief. He did not just hand people money or things like that. FDR, who came after him, was much more willing through the New Deal to provide direct relief to people. But Hoover, like I said, was afraid of this extension of federal government because it had never been done before. All right, so the economy plummets. By the spring of 1932, there were thousands of Americans facing starvation. Like, they were literally going to starve to death because they did not have food. In Philadelphia, there was an 11-day period where there was no money anywhere for relief. And so families there were living on stale bread, thin soup, and basically garbage. People were digging through the garbage to try to find food. Some tenants gave up on getting rent, and so they allowed people to actually continue to live on the property for free so that their place would not be burned up for fuel by scavengers. And so for people who couldn't pay rent, in some cases they were allowed to continue to live there. And then there were several people who could not pay their rent and they were evicted. And when they were evicted, because they couldn't pay rent, they established these shanty towns they called them Hoovervilles, because they blamed Hoover for the terrible effects that they were seeing from the Great Depression. I actually have a picture of one. And so you can see here, some people have actually even decorated with photographs, which I find interesting. But you have these two men, and they are lighting a cigarette. You see a broom, and this lean-to housing. So this is housing that was constructed in a quick manner with whatever resources they had available. So this is not like real housing. With the zoning codes and things we have today, this would never fly. But they affectionately called these Hoovervilles because, like I said, they blamed Hoover for having to live like this. Okay, so the sad irony of this is that you have people begging for food while food prices had hit rock bottom. Like we said, overproduction on farms led to too much food, therefore the price went down. But people, if you don't have money, you don't have money. And so people could not even afford food, even though the prices had dropped dramatically. The prices, in fact, dropped so dramatically that farmers went on these farm holidays. And these farm holiday movements were where farmers would withhold farm products from the market in the hopes that prices would rise for food. So another interesting thing that happens during this time, in 1932, there were veterans who marched on Washington because they had not received their war bonuses from World War I. And so 20,000 World War I veterans participated in this march, participated in the march, and Congress rejected their appeal. Some of them actually refused to leave and they set up camp there. And so the federal troops had to come dismiss this bonus army. The effects of the Great Depression were unprecedented in the United States, and so some people turned to really radical ideologies like communism. They wanted the state to mobilize the economy, take over everything, redistribute the food, the wealth, the land, and all of that, because there were stories of low unemployment in Russia. So to some, it appeared like the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia was working. So it's important to remember too that the personal stress of the Great Depression also had a psychological impact on people. Because there were simply no jobs, apathy resulted. And so people who had lost jobs would search for new ones for several months, And then they basically realized that there was no hope of them ever having a job again for as long as this Great Depression lasted. So they became extremely apathetic about finding jobs, and there was this sense of learned helplessness where they perceived that they were powerless to control their situation. Some wives were very sympathetic toward their breadwinner husbands, but others were mean to their breadwinner husbands, and they blamed their husbands and said, "It's your fault that you can't find a job. You just need to work harder. I can't believe that you are allowing our family to face this crisis." And so there were some families who were under a significant amount of stress because wives were blaming husbands for their economic situation. Family size decreased. So there was a dramatic drop in the birth rate during this time. You can see why people would not want to bring a child into this. And so this is the lowest birth rate in American history. Hopelessness, malnutrition were just rampant. And this, like I said a few minutes ago, contributed to the political radicalism during the Depression, people turning to socialism and communism and wanting the government to take drastic action to alleviate the stress of the Great Depression. All right, so that brings us to the election of 1932. You have Herbert Hoover, who is the incumbent president, and so he secures the Republican nomination, and then he is challenged by the governor of New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And so Roosevelt campaigns on optimism. He campaigns on a New Deal. He offers this grand solution, but he really isn't very specific about how he is going to alleviate the nation's economic woes. And so people were desperate for a change. And so even though Roosevelt was not very specific, they voted for him. And so FDR wins with an electoral margin of 472 to Hoover's 59. In the last days of the Hoover administration, before FDR actually took office, saw the lowest point of the Great Depression. All right, we're done, and we will talk about the New Deal next. All right, don't forget to send me a picture of your notes.